Great. Well, thanks very much to everyone for coming. So this paper is the first one that actually we've all worked on together in the project. So I'm hoping that it will be a good one. We just got an R&R actually, so we're hoping that it will be coming out sometime soon in the Asian Journal. Nicholas just arrived, so in the Asian Journal of Philosophy, we're trying to support this new journal. So we're going to give the talk. Actually, Andre and William, who are the two core team members in the project, are going to give the talk. Although, you know, and I didn't write a lot of the paper, probably most of it, I have to say, because it engages with Jon Williamson, who we're also very glad to have here. Jon and I have had a little bit of an exchange on evidence before and other issues. Jon is a professor of reasoning, inference, and scientific method, and also the co-director of the Centre for Reasoning at the University of Kent at Canterbury. He works on a lot of different issues, but probably he's best known among those people who are interested in formal epistemological things for his work on objective Bayesianism. This idea that our degrees of belief should have kind of objective constraints, so that quite often they should be single valued, not all the time, but quite often. Be like that. He also works on causality and method in medicine, and of course evidence, which is the topic today. So we're going to start with the talk from Andre and William, and then we're going to have a response from Jon to the talk, and then we'll have a little bit of a break for a few minutes, and then we'll go into questions. Okay, over to you then, Andre and William.
Okay, so I'm going to begin. Okay, so the title of our paper is Evidence, Computation, and AI, Why Evidence Ain't Just in the Head, a reference to the idea that meanings just ain't in the head, or ain't just in the head. So the plan of this talk is going to be, I'm going to talk about some of the background, and particularly the notion of evidence in confirmation theory. Then I'm going to explain the particular view of evidence that we advocate in the paper. So evidence as pertinent or as relevant, available information. Then Andre is going to talk about a particular concern about accessibility, and also a case study which shows some of the advantages of the E equals I view that we defend. So to start off with some background, imagine you have some AI weather forecasting system that draws on lots of different forms of live and historical data. And when we say lots, we really mean lots. So a lot of information, far more than any individual human being could ever take in and conceive and think about. And using this information, the system tells us what weather we should expect in the future. And these AI systems do exist in meteorological institutes and so on. Now consider a particular prediction made by such a system. Say there's an 80% chance of rain tomorrow afternoon. How should we explain our attitude towards this prediction? So there's definitely some sort of attitude of trust or belief, or using some sort of suitability for use, some sort of attitude we have towards this prediction. What's going on there? Well, one option, which is, I think, now very common in formal epistemology and epistemology more generally, is what we call a mentalistic approach. So on this approach, we might cite our intersubjective evidence, so the evidence we share in our minds, or perhaps more typically, the evidence we have access to in our heads. So we don't, as I say, have the information, the data that the AI system is using, but we do have beliefs about how the system is set up, what sorts of data it receives, and how it has performed in the past. So we have a kind of sense that this is a reliable tool, and almost like a sort of black box, where in the sense that we don't have the information in question, but the information used by the system gives us this prediction that we trust. And the mentalistic approaches include a variety of theories of evidence. Two in particular I'm going to use to explain them are subjective Bayesianism and the E equals K view. No, not the E equals I view, but E equals K view. So subjective Bayesianism, here represented by Jan Springer, who one person I can definitely say is subjective Bayesian in this sense. Subjective Bayesians normally analyze evidential relations in terms of mental relations among degrees of belief, subject to certain constraints. These constraints are not really important today. Now, suppose that we have some agent, some person, and we can model their beliefs using a probability function P defined over a sigma algebra of statements. Basically, a load of statements that they have some awareness of, some conception of. Each of these statements has a probability function, a probability given by P. In standard subjective Bayesianism, an agent's evidence consists of the statements with a probability of 1, and a statement which is sort of the maximum degree of certainty, the maximum degree of belief that the agent can have in anything. And a statement E is evidentially relevant to another statement H, if and only if the conditional probability of H given E is different from the probability of H. So in other words, if E is probabilistically relevant in the sense of mathematical probability, then it is also evidentially relevant and vice versa. So this view implies that evidence is essentially mental. It's all fundamentally about degrees of belief. I have to say, though, that subjective Bayesians tend not to discuss this fact, but it is an implication of the way they define evidence and other evidential notions like evidential relevance. Another quite different example of a mentalistic view is the view of evidence advocated by Tim Williamson. He has argued that our evidence is our knowledge. So our evidence E is the same thing as our knowledge K, and then vice versa. Our knowledge is what is our evidence. So equals here is marking identity, not predication, saying it's the same thing. And at least in the case of Williamson, he argues that knowledge is a mental state, so knowledge itself is something mental. He doesn't actually accept a sort of justified true belief plus something else, something to deal with Gettier problems. He doesn't accept that kind of analysis of knowledge. In fact, one of his big research programs is to try to analyze other epistemic notions in terms of knowledge. And there's a whole tradition of that at Oxford, going back at least to John Cook Wilson. However, that's all to say that evidence is still mentalistic, however, because evidence is knowledge and knowledge is a type of mental state. So evidence is still something in the head, or at least partly in the head. There's a complicated story there, but that's not relevant today. Another view of evidence, which includes a broad category of different philosophers of evidence, is a non-mentalistic approach. So on this view, the evidence underpinning our decision to use the prediction of the weather system that I mentioned earlier is the data provided to the AI by things like weather monitoring stations at present and also perhaps historically. So on this view, evidence is not mental in the sense that an evidential relation can exist between some data E and hypothesis H without anyone accepting E, without anyone recognizing the existence of the evidential relation, or even without anyone understanding E. I'll give some examples of that later. And so, at least in this respect, evidential relations in the non-mentalistic view are comparable to how most philosophers regard deductive logical relations, so that long before English even existed as a language, the premises, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, that argument was a valid argument even before English had even developed as a language. And on such a view, there's a mind-independent relation between the evidence and the predicted outcome. So even after the end of the human race and the end of the AI system, there will still be this evidential relation between the data provided to the AI and the prediction that it's making. And just a few examples of non-mentalists in confirmation theory and the philosophy of science are Karl Popper up here, Rudolf Carnap here, Carl Hempel, who I've not pictured here, and Clark Leamore here, smoking a cigar. So our goals for this talk are to elaborate a specific version of this approach to evidence, and in this particular version, E equals I. Now, this is not the sort of using the identity sign for identity, for it being the same thing. So we're not saying that evidence and information, so evidence and information, we're not saying that these are the same thing. We're saying that evidence is an instance of information. So evidence is a subclass of the broader category of information. We're then going to address some criticisms of the E equals I view that have been raised by Jon Williamson, not Tim Williamson, Jon Williamson. And we're going to argue that the E equals I view is highly congenial if we want to understand how certain AI-based systems use evidence. So, on to the next step. I'll explain this view in detail a bit more. So, just as a reminder, because we can't say this often enough, saying that evidence is a kind of information or particular category of information, not saying that all information is evidence. And this view was developed by Darrell in the 2014 paper, where he proposed that evidence is pertinent available information or relevant available information, same thing. And by information, this itself is quite a sort of controversial concept. But the sense of information we mean here is that information is what is left over from knowledge when you subtract justification, truth, belief, and the thinker. And this is a view of information outlined by Dunn in 2008. And so in this section of the talk, we're going to clarify the notion of information at issue. So you might think that information is just propositions. So propositions are these, well, controversial what they are, but some mind-independent things which are what sentences that mean the same thing have in common. So the classic example is the idea that snow is white, that sentence in English, and Schnee is weiß, I think, that's probably incorrect, but the equivalent German sentence, or I think the French sentence is the neige is blanc. Again, I'm sure that's not quite right. But anyway, these different sentences in different languages mean the same thing, even though they are different sentences, and the idea is they express the same proposition. However, we don't require that all information at least be represented in propositional form. Representational vehicles can either be linguistic, like sentences, or non-linguistic, like maps. So something like a map, here there's a map of Lingnan University and the surrounding area. That's not a set of propositions. That's a graphical display, which we can use to convey certain propositions, and certain propositions can be provoked by it. So that, for example, Lingnan University is near to Parkland Villas. That's a proposition that is suggested to us by the map, but the map is not that set of propositions. In this paper, we remain neutral on the question of whether all information is propositional, and whether or not it may be expressible in a propositional form. But certainly there are ways of conveying propositions or information, or they may be the same thing, but conveying these that are not linguistic. Now, why might you think that, obviously some people might think that, okay, evidence equals confirmation, evidence equals information. That sounds sensible enough. But I don't see why that's a problem for mentalism and why we can't still have a mentalistic view, because maybe information is itself really something fundamentally to do with mental notions like beliefs and so on. And why might you think that? Why might you think that information is mental? Well, one reason might be that you think that information always requires an interpreter. And certainly very often there's someone who can interpret some informational vehicle like a map, so we can all read this map and get information from it. But there are counterexamples where there seems to be information even though no one can interpret the meanings in question, or interpret the information in question, you can get it from it. So one example in the literature is the Rosetta Stone. So this contained mainly two bits of information, one that's not so interesting, which was a declaration in 196 BC by King Ptolemy V, saying that basically people should be worshipping him. More importantly, from a historical perspective, was the fact that using these scripts in hieroglyphics, Demotic, and ancient Greek, scholars in the very early 19th century were able to use their knowledge of the Greek text to decipher Demotic and then also hieroglyphics, even though hieroglyphics and Demotic as well actually had been unreadable from about the 5th century. So even the idea is that even when people couldn't read hieroglyphics or Demotic, nonetheless there was information in the Rosetta Stone, and information of a very valuable sort, as it turned out. An example of this sort of phenomenon today is the Voynich manuscript, which is a 15th century manuscript. No one knows who wrote it, and also no one knows actually what it says. So quantitative analysis has revealed that it's almost certainly a language. It does have the pattern of a language, but no one's been able to decipher it, even though actually there are these illustrations that would be helpful, but for the fact that they seem to be of sort of imaginary plants and thus not really very useful. Another reason you might have for thinking that information has to be something really fundamentally mental is the idea that, well, there must be at least some original intent if there's information. However, again, we can imagine what seems to be a sort of unintended information. So imagine a Neolithic tribe who find that there's a really nice correspondence between some rock formations in their local area and the stars and some astronomical constellations. So they can use these rock formations to make predictions of the movements of the stars, or maybe they could also use them for keeping time. Actually, an example of this is places like Minehow and Maeshow in the Orkney Islands, which can be used for tracking the solstices. But these are sort of artificial caverns where the light comes in at a certain time of year at a certain location. So you can use these caves as calendars, essentially. Another one artificial intelligence system we're going to talk about later, AlphaFold 2. Andre is going to explain this, but in this particular example, it's quite cool in that both making this point and the point I made in the previous slide. So there's neither an original intent to a lot of the inferences being made in the AlphaFold 2, nor a human interpreter of the intermediate data encoded within the system. So there's going to be this artificial intelligence system, or there's artificial intelligence systems like AlphaFold 2 that are interpreting the information, but don't seem to be doing it in a mental sense, because these are not sort of any sort of artificial intelligence you want to say is like a human mind or a more than human mind. It's in a sense, rather mechanical system. So it's a stretch to say it has beliefs or degrees of belief, but it does seem to be using information as an input and then giving outputs in a sort of evidential way. Another view that it's just worth noting is you might think that all evidence is propositional, and we don't need to take a very harsh stance on this point, but there are some reasons to doubt it. So Timothy Williamson, again, he advocates this idea that all evidence is propositional, but it does seem that there are non-propositional items that play a role in it, in applying theories of evidence, confirmation theories. So data points and error bars in a graph might constrain the probabilities that we can assign to hypotheses for a given interpretation of these non-propositional items. Now, you might still want to say that's not evidence. Actually, as it happens, that doesn't really make a big difference, because provided you don't think the propositions are something really fundamentally mental, then that's also fine for a non-mentalistic view, such as the E equals I view. One point where the E equals I view is, I think, quite provocative, is that the idea that information does not have to be true. So it follows then that if you can have, well, at least it's possible then to say that if not all information is true, and evidence is a kind of information, then maybe not all evidence is true. And this actually helps make sense of quite a bit of science, really, because much of what is treated as evidence, or as what you want to call background information or knowledge in science, is not even approximately true. So hypotheses are often evaluated in science using simplified models and theories. Science just couldn't work otherwise. For example, Newtonian physics was used to guide the reasoning in the Apollo space missions. So Newtonian physics is actually really not even approximately true when we consider all the possible phenomena in space and time. But it's a good enough approximation, especially in certain contexts. And from a pragmatic point of view, it's much simpler to use Newtonian physics than post-Newtonian physics for landing on the moon. So the Apollo space missions were guided by Newtonian physics, even though Newtonian physics was known not to be approximately true. But again, I'm not denying that Newtonian physics is true, approximately true of certain phenomena. And one sort of useful distinction you can make from an E equals I view is to distinguish the evidence that's used in philosophy when we're talking about confirmation functions. So when we're talking about the evidential support that some piece of evidence gives for some hypothesis. And in that context, you might have potentially false assumptions in your evidence. So in what we call EP for practical evidence. So the evidence adopted for practical reasons. From ET, so true evidence, and that's a subset of what we use in science, which contains only true information. And at that point, I'm going to pass it over to Andre. Thank you.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. Okay, can everybody see those slides? Cool. Okay, so William has sort of given you the core of the E equals I view, and I am going to elaborate a little bit in light of some criticisms raised by Jon Williamson, and then I'm going to say sort of why you might like this view with reference to a particular case study, AlphaFold, which William also mentioned earlier. Okay, so here is a sort of motivating concern to get us started. This comes from Jon Williamson's very nice paper, Deliberation, Judgment, and the Nature of Evidence. There's lots of interesting stuff in the paper. I commend it to you all, but I'm just going to focus on one particular thing here. So here's the concern. So the concern, well, it concerns the notion of accessibility at play in the E equals I account. And in particular, here's Williamson, much hinges on how accessible the information must be in order to count as evidence. One might think that if ought implies can, an agent should not be deemed irrational when her degrees of belief neglect information that she has forgotten or lost or that was destroyed because she cannot access that information. But if E equals I, then in certain cases she may be deemed irrational. A cook may have forgotten whether Mornay sauce contains Gruyere cheese and may be deliberating as to how strongly she should believe that proposition. If E equals I, and that information is in her notebook, then she should fully believe or disbelieve it because it's part of her evidence as long as the notebook is accessible to her. But how accessible? She may not have time to look at the notebook. She may have left it at home. She may have lent it to a friend far away. Indeed, it seems that many of the propositions about which we deliberate can be answered by delving into information that is accessible in some remote sense. Does that mean that we should have firm beliefs about all these propositions? By divorcing evidence from any sort of propositional attitude of the agent, the advocate of E equals I has no immediate answer to these questions about accessibility. So just what does accessibility come to on the E equals I account? Well, so one preliminary sort of observation is that it seems like there are really two concerns here. So one is a concern about rationality. Sort of broadly speaking, what is it rational for someone to believe given her evidence? And in particular, if you're trying to do a kind of Bayesian epistemology, what's the appropriate notion of accessibility when you're trying to apply norms of Bayesianism to, say, degrees of belief? So that's one sort of concern. But there's also just a concern about like accessibility itself, just what is accessibility and how accessible must a type of information be to count as evidence. So I'll take these one at a time. With respect to the first sort of aspect of the concern, we would want to emphasize that E equals I, it's not a view of rational belief per se. Rather, it's a view about the proper interpretation of confirmation theory, or if you like, it's a theory about evidential relations. And it seems to us that these things are orthogonal to each other. And so there's lots of different views you could have about the relationship between confirmation on the one hand and what it's rational to believe on the other. For example, E could have an evidential relation to some hypothesis, and yet it could nevertheless be rational for us to ignore it because it provides, say, extremely weak evidence, or that because we have better use, better things to be doing with our cognitive resources than identifying that fact. It seems to us that this is possible. So the sort of connection between rational belief and proper interpretation of confirmation theory are two different issues. Now, this isn't to say that beliefs can't be relevant to the E equals I view sort of full stop, but they're only relevant insofar as they bear on an individual or a group's confirmation estimate for some theory. Again, E equals I is about how confirmation theory works in scientific practice. And of course, one aspect of scientific practice is that scientists are making confirmation estimates. And so if the beliefs that some scientists have bear on that estimate, then of course beliefs are relevant in that sense, but we're not making a claim about, say, what is rational for those scientists to believe. So that's what we want to say about the first sort of aspect of the criticism, is that we're not trying to do normative epistemology, I guess, more broadly. But there is a question here about like, what is accessibility for us and what's it supposed to come to? And this is a sort of perfectly reasonable question, and we'll try to say a little bit about it with some caveats in mind. So one, I guess the main caveat is that we're not going to try to give a wholly general account of when and to what extent some information is accessible, mainly because it seems to us that there's always going to be a kind of cost-benefit analysis involved when you're using your evidence. Time spent gathering new evidence could be spent in other ways. And so given that, there are going to be cases and there are going to be cases, and how things shake out will very likely differ between cases, trying to give a wholly general account is inappropriate. Okay, so with those sorts of caveats in mind, we do think that, well, let's try to say something about what accessibility comes to. And well, we actually think that Williamson has something very congenial for us later on in the paper that we mentioned earlier. Now, Williamson is defending a view called E equals G, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on. The E equals G view holds that your evidence is what's rationally granted in a context. But we think that sort of the account of accessibility that Williamson proposes can be adapted to the E equals I view very nicely. So here's what Williamson has to say about accessibility. So there are two chief ways in which one might demand that evidence be accessible. As far as the Bayesian is concerned, that part's not going to concern us too much, but this is Williamson. As far as the Bayesian is concerned, in order to deliberate about how strongly to believe various propositions of interest, the agent does not need to be able to articulate her body of evidence in propositional form. She merely needs to be able to identify the constraints that evidence imposes on her degrees of belief via the Bayesian norms. On the other hand, in order to deliberate about whether or not to grant a proposition theta, she needs a belief function and a utility function relative to a prior body of evidence E. The second task requires perhaps a stronger sense of accessibility, since not only does it require accessibility in the Bayesian sense in order to determine the belief function, but also the agent needs to be able to assess epistemic qualities of evidence, such as its consistency or coherence, in order to determine the utility of adding theta to her body of evidence. In neither case, though, is there a requirement that the agent be able to articulate each and every item of evidence. Okay. So transposing these suggestions into our own preferred idiom of confirmation rather than rational degrees of belief, it seems to us that there are two main suggestions here. I'm just going to call them weak accessibility and strong accessibility. So weak accessibility says some information is weakly accessible if a subject can identify some evidence is weakly accessible if a subject can identify the constraints that evidence imposes on one's hypotheses. Now, notice that this is, it's possible for this to be the case even if you have a non-mentalistic notion of evidence of the sort, that the E equals I view has. So, imagine that you're a scientist and you've got a spreadsheet full of data points that you've collected after doing some experiment, and you're trying to draw a sort of, say, a line of best fit through these data points, just using pencil and paper methods. Even if, some of these data points aren't believed by you, even if you don't, maybe you weren't paying attention fully when you were carrying out the data collection process, or maybe, you've got this is a very routine task for you, and you've got like The Simpsons on in the background, and so you're not sort of fully paying attention to the particular data points. You can fill the story out however you like. It seems that, these data points can constrain the hypothesis that you use to, or the hypothesis that you are generating in the form of this sort of line of best fit, because, you can appreciate how to fit the curve to the points, given the way that they're distributed on the page. So that's weak accessibility. Strong accessibility is weak accessibility. So this ability to identify the constraints that your information imposes. Plus, you can determine the utility of adding an item to your body of evidence. And again, it seems that you can understand this in broadly non-mentalistic terms. So, suppose that you're sticking with the same example, suppose that your data set has some outliers which make it so that you can't quite get, say, a straight line to fit all of the data. One thing you might do is discard some of those points, perhaps on the grounds that it's highly probable that you made an error in recording them, or that there was some other mistake that happened in the data collection process. So this is a kind of, say, consistency or coherence check that you're carrying out. And again, it seems like you can do that, or that can be understood in non-mentalistic terms. You needn't have a belief corresponding to each and every individual outlier. In fact, this is the sort of thing that could be completely automated, and in fact nowadays often is. So the overall point here is just that neither sense of accessibility requires evidence to be in one's head. And so we can adapt these conceptions of accessibility to the E equals I view and help fill out that portion of it. Now, I said that Williamson advocates the E equals G view. And I'll just say one quick thing about it. So E equals G is the view that one's evidence is what is taken for granted. And we are, I think, sympathetic to E equals G, provided that being taken for granted is, or at least can be understood in some cases in non-mentalistic terms. So if we were to say, transpose this into the language that William introduced earlier in terms of EP and ET. So EP, recall, is the evidence that actually features in confirmation functions, and it may include, bits of false information. But EP can include only information that is taken for granted. That would be one way of merging these two views. And we might think that ET, so this is the subset of EP that contains only true information, that includes only information that it's possible to take for granted. So in that sense, we think that the E equals I and E equals G view are complementary, or at least not inconsistent with each other entirely. We would want to say, though, that not everything that is taken for granted is evidence, though, so we wouldn't agree with the other direction of E equals G, for the reason just that, you can take things for granted that don't seem to be straightforwardly evidential in character, something like a hypothesis, or maybe a theory you can take for granted, although it's questionable whether those sorts of things are evidential. Okay, so that was a little bit about accessibility. Let me round things off with this discussion of the case study. So we've given you a lot of sort of details about the view. Here's one reason why you might find it attractive. So increasingly often nowadays, human involvement in sort of all different aspects of science is decreasing. So data collection, data analysis, prediction, and maybe even sort of in long-term experimentation and hypothesis generation will decrease, at least in the medium and long term, but we're seeing sort of glimmers of this already now. So, you can imagine a situation in which future science is highly automated, and in fact, most of the scientific process is carried out not by humans, but by various kinds of machines. And most likely, these are going to be AI systems in some respect or another. So contemporary machine learning systems are now very good, and it's not implausible to think that these are sort of crude forerunners of the kinds of systems that we imagine will occupy a central place in future science. So the sort of question you might have if you're thinking about this admittedly somewhat speculative scenario is, well, should this highly automated kind of science come about, how should we think about scientific evidence in light of this development? And our view is that the E equals I view is a natural candidate. And here's why. I mean, I should say, just by way of sort of, covering my bases, I'm not going to try to argue that like a mentalist doesn't have anything they could say about this case. Rather, this is just a sort of prima facie motivation for additional motivation for the equals I view. So, okay, so that's all sort of by way of setup for the case. The case we want to talk about has to do with protein folding. So this is like one of the most successful applications of AI in science in the last few years. You may have heard about it in some form or another. It has to do with folding proteins. And so the basic problem is that we want to be able to predict a protein's three-dimensional structure from its amino acid sequence. And it'd be really nice if we could do this, because the functional and sort of mechanistic characteristics of a protein depend to a large extent on its 3D structure. And this turns out to be important for all sorts of problems in biology, medicine, pharmacology, and so on. Now, until sort of like the late 90s, researchers used basically a mix of experimentation and theory to try to predict shape with relatively modest success. But really, in the last sort of few years, some significant advances have been made that have basically changed the game. As sort of one commentator put it, we've solved structural biology. That's an overstatement, but it's indicative of just how radical a shift there is. So the system I am talking about is AlphaFold 2, which you may have heard of before. So what is AlphaFold 2? Really briefly, it's a kind of deep neural network. So it's an artificial neural network with some other special properties that I'll mention. If you haven't come across an artificial neural network before, here's the quick and dirty. So you can think of it as like a directed graph composed of nodes. These are the circles on the right-hand side, and then connections between nodes. And these connections have different weights. And when you give the network an input, a signal propagates throughout the network, and how it propagates depends on the weights connecting these nodes, which are added up and they determine if a node sends a signal out or not, depending on whether the incoming signal has a certain value. So a deep neural network is just like one of these things, except there's a lot more layers, and it's much more complicated. And it can be much more complicated in a few different ways. So it can have a various kind of activation function. You can think of that as the character of the arrow connecting those nodes, the way that the different layers are connected to each other can vary, and in different kinds of deep neural network architectures, you get different kinds of connections. In some cases, they loop back around on each other. Lots and lots of different options out there in the market. So this is what AlphaFold looks like, just to give you sort of a very high level view of what it looks like. So on the left-hand side here, we have an input sequence of amino acids, some pre-processing happens, and then it's got two chunks, the thing called the evoformer and the structure module. And these are the deep neural network components of AlphaFold. And in effect, what it does is it takes an input sequence and it comes up with what its designers call a structural hypothesis for what the 3D structure encoded by that input sequence is. So that's the thing on the right-hand side here. And so what AlphaFold does when you give it this input sequence, it goes through a whole bunch of very complicated processing, and then eventually it spits out, here's the 3D structure encoded by this input sequence, and it gives you sort of the confidence levels for, how confident it is in a particular part of the structure. So, you might be more confident in the backbone structure, but less confident in these little side chains, depends on the sequence in question. So AlphaFold turns out to be extraordinarily successful. Like I said earlier, it's basically solved structural, or at least some commentary has suggested that it's basically solved structural biology. So this looks like a really natural kind of case for us to look at. Why is that? Well, it works by, very crudely, learning rules for predicting protein structure from amino acid sequence. We don't really know what those rules are. because it's all encoded in the neural network in these two main blocks here. And these neural networks are extraordinarily large, like millions and millions of individual nodes. And we don't really understand how they work. But what seems to be going on is that AlphaFold has learned rules, and they're encoded in the weights between these nodes for predicting protein structure from amino acid sequences. Now, we would want to say that it looks like the input data and the intermediate weights that are developed as AlphaFold learns how to predict proteins, they seem to be functioning like evidence for AlphaFold as it comes up with a hypothesis about how a given amino acid sequence folds. Now, why is that interesting for our purposes? Well, it doesn't really look like this information is revealed to any human being, especially the intermediate information, at any point in the process. In fact, for any information that's contained in these deep neural network blocks, because we don't really understand how they work, there's no straightforward way to interpret what's going on inside of them. And so, you know, even if there is, well, we would want to say there's evidence in there for AlphaFold, but it's not the sort of thing that we're in a position to believe or to grasp. So it's not the sort of thing that you could have the appropriate sort of mental state about. So if you like these thoughts, then E equals I suggests itself as a very natural view of evidence to try to tell at least one story about what's going on in the AlphaFold case. Okay, so let me wrap up. So what is E equal I doing? Well, it's giving us a theory of evidence that seems especially suitable for understanding the role of evidence in AI systems like AlphaFold 2. Of course, AlphaFold 2 isn't the only one, and really we've got our eye on potentially more sophisticated future systems as well. As I mentioned when I was discussing accessibility, it seems like the difference between that there are, you know, it's important to keep a few different projects in mind here. And this is one of the cuts, I think, between the E equals I and something like N equals G, and perhaps these mentalistic views more broadly. It's mostly one of having different goals. You know, understanding evidence's role in rational belief versus understanding evidence in confirmation relations. And we would want to emphasize that we are interested in the second task or the second project and not so much the first. But that's what we've got. Thank you very much. And John, we are looking forward to your thoughts.
Great, thanks very much. You might want to make John a co-host so that he can share in a moment. I just wanted to add a couple of things that maybe didn't come across as clearly as they might have done in the talk. So one thing we would want to say, going back to the very first example, we don't want to say that you shouldn't reason by thinking about how reliable the system is and then trust it because you have an idea about you know how it works and it's worked well in the past. That's fine. We just think there's another kind of way you can reason too, which is that the system itself has good evidence for its conclusion. In fact, the first kind of reasoning can support the second. The other thing is about this difference between EP and ET, which is mentioned but perhaps not explained as fully as it might have been. So the idea behind that is as follows. There are two notions of evidence you might have. We don't really want to say one is really evidence, the other one really isn't, or anything like that. But there's the evidence, there's what people actually use when they're calculating a confirmation value in science, right? What's your evidence when you ask a scientist that? They'll point you to a data set. Okay, that's what they're actually using. And that could contain false information, right? I mean, we all know it often does contain false information. Often you hope that it has a preponderance enough of true or approximately true information kind of wash out the false bits. So that's the EP bit where you actually use. And then there's this ET, which is what you'd ideally use. Okay. Now, what you'd ideally use would only, of course, be the true proper subset of the information. But there also might have been other things that you didn't use, although you could have used. Like in John's example, you could have looked in the cookbook. But of course, whether you look in the cookbook or not, your recipe book or not, will depend on pragmatic factors because there's opportunity costs involved. Yeah. I mean, scientists couldn't use all, you don't look back when you're doing astronomy to the tables published 200 years ago, although potentially they do have some evidential value, right? It's just too much hard work. Okay, so that explains hopefully that We're not denying reasoning in a mentalistic way or anything people say about that. We think there's something supplementary, and we think there needs two notions of evidence. Hopefully that will be useful in framing some other stuff. I don't know if Jon mentions this, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. Okay, Jon, I'll pass over to you. Thanks a lot.
Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for great paper. I've got to say first that I really enjoyed the paper, and I think this idea of trying to look at the AlphaFold 2 case study to see how it relates to theories of evidence is a really nice one, I think, because clearly we're going to have to deal with how evidence is construed in AI systems, and that's going to be a challenge to many theories of evidence. So I really like the approach of the paper. As a Bayesian confirmation theorist, I don't really want to draw a sharp distinction between evidence as rational belief and evidence as how it informs rational belief and evidence in confirmation theory. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the E equals G view and how it relates to the E equals I view. So first of all, what is E equals G? Well, E equals G holds that evidence is what's rationally granted for the purposes of inquiry, as we heard during the talk. Here, granting a proposition is committing to treat it as true and set any doubts aside. And you're setting your doubts aside within a particular context, for example. So it can be rational to grant the laws of Newtonian mechanics when you're designing the Apollo moon landings for NASA, but it wouldn't necessarily be rational to grant Newtonian mechanics in other contexts that NASA faces. What does it mean to grant the laws of Newtonian mechanics? Well, you treat them as true and set any doubts aside within that context. So for the purposes of calculating the trajectories of the Apollo mission and so on. And I'm also open to this possibility that you can grant non-proposition, so you might grant methods, experiences. I like the map example in the talk as well, grant the map somehow. But I do think I'm going to focus a bit on granting propositions here, as that's a sort of central case. Now, the way we normally think of evidence is the role of evidence is to constrain beliefs. So it guides rational belief. And E equals G is plausible for two reasons. One, whatever's your evidence, you ought to grant. And why is this? Well, it needs to be granted in order to impose firm constraints on belief. So you have to grant your evidence, because if you didn't grant your evidence, if you questioned it, it wouldn't be obvious as to how it could impose constraints on beliefs. Also, your evidence needs to be rationally held so that beliefs that fit the evidence qualify as rational. So if evidence is a determinant of rational belief, then evidence must be rationally held. In the other direction, what you grant needs to be evidence, because what you grant ought to constrain your beliefs. It doesn't make sense to say things like, I grant that it's raining, but I don't believe it. That's a kind of more paradoxical statement. It's clear that whatever you're granting has a role in constraining your beliefs. So it has a role as evidence. But there's a proviso here. What you grant has a role in constraining your beliefs as long as you're rational to grant it. So if you grant the moon is made of blue cheese, for example, and you're not rational to grant that, then that proposition doesn't count as your evidence. But if you combine the two directions, then we have the theory that E equals G. Okay, so let's look at the connection between E equals G and E equals I. Well, there are two main points of agreement between the two approaches here. First of all, I completely agree with William and Andre and Daryl that evidence need not all be true. And clearly that's going to be important for applications like AlphaFold 2, where which takes as evidence data that is not necessarily veridical. I also agree that propositions don't need to be entertained in order to count as evidence. So I think this is an important aspect of the E equals I theory. I think that it's a kind of particularly attractive aspect of the E equals I theory is that you don't need to entertain or mentally grasp a proposition in order for it to count as evidence. And how does the E equals G account deal with that? Well, you can implicitly commit to treat a proposition as true by presupposing the proposition. So maybe it's a presupposition of your reasoning. So you take it for granted in an implicit way. Then it's also that proposition is also acting as part of your body of evidence. So I think the E equals G account can handle that case by acknowledging that we can implicitly take things for granted, as well as actively and explicitly grant propositions. Sometimes we explicitly commit to take a proposition as true without fully mentally grasping the proposition. So if I say what she said, I may not fully understand what she said, but what I'm signaling there is I agree and grant whatever she said because that sounded plausible to me, or I think she's particularly reliable, or given the data available to AlphaFold 2. So that again, I'm granting that data without mentally grasping that data. And I think that's possible under the E equals G account. And note that I may not even have the capacity to understand the relevant propositions. I can still grant them in this indirect way by committing to treat them as true. So those are two kind of main points of agreement between the two accounts. One key point of disagreement, as was mentioned in the paper, is that under the E equals G account, evidence is construed in terms of a propositional attitude. So there is something mentalistic about the E equals G account, and this propositional attitude is granting. Now, there are various different theories about what propositional attitudes are. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I do want to emphasize that granting isn't always a mental state. As we've seen in the above examples, you can implicitly take propositions for granted. You can explicitly, but without directly grasping them, take them for granted. So granting can include implicit or explicit commitments that are induced by your mental states, but you don't necessarily mentally grasp the propositions that you grant. So I think the key disagreement between E equals G and E equals I is that E equals G defines evidence in terms of a propositional attitude, whereas E equals I doesn't. So let's look a bit as to why you might construe evidence in terms of propositional attitudes. And here's an example. You have two notebooks of data, both of which are accessible to you. So both of the information in front of you, if you like, one blue and the other red. As it happens, you use the blue notebook, but not the red notebook to guide your beliefs. Why? Well, the red notebook was compiled by someone that you take to be unreliable. And so you set that aside and you only grant the contents of the blue notebook. Plausibly, only the blue notebook contains your evidence here. So although both notebooks are information that are fully accessible to you, you're only taking the blue notebook as evidence. And you're rational to do that because you have some reason to think that the red notebook is somehow less reliable. Now, accounts of evidence that analyze evidence in terms of propositional attitudes can accommodate this quite well, because you have the attitude, the required attitude towards the blue notebook, but you don't have it towards the red notebook. What's the required attitude here? Well, it's granting. You grant the contents of the blue notebook, but you don't grant the contents of the red notebook. So I think equals G helps to validate our intuitions about what the evidence is in this example. And that's a challenge for accounts of evidence that don't analyze evidence in terms of propositional attitudes, like equals I. Rational granting is important here. So maybe you have another notebook that is beige with orange stripes and green polka dots. You don't take this as evidence because you can't bear to look at the cover. So you don't grant its contents. Here, perhaps you're not rational to ignore the contents of this notebook. You're ignoring it for aesthetic reasons, not for truth-bearing reasons. So you're not rational to refrain from granting the contents of that notebook. Now, you're not granting the information in that notebook explains you're not taking it as evidence, but really it is a part of your evidence because it's what you ought to grant. Maybe you're rational to set aside the red notebook, rational to grant the contents of the blue notebook, but not rational to set this other notebook aside. So we need to take rational granting into account if we're going to analyze evidence, I think. So that's the merits of an account of evidence in terms of a propositional attitude, like granting. Why might a propositional attitude approach be problematic? Well, as the paper we've just heard nicely outlines, we want to say that an AI system makes use of evidence. For example, a system may learn to rely on just on one of two data streams, and we want to say that that stream constitutes its evidence. That's its blue notebook, if you like. It's setting aside the other data stream, which is analogous to the red notebook. The problem is we're going to be reluctant to ascribe certain propositional attitudes to current AI systems. So if you hold the E equals K view, you're going to be reluctant to say that the AI system knows the contents of one data stream but doesn't know the contents of the other. Similarly, with E equals G, you might be reluctant to ascribe granting to the AI system because the system doesn't consciously grant the contents of one of the data streams. So that's the key challenge, I think, for the propositional attitude approach that's put forward by this paper. But I think there's a way that we can accommodate this challenge. We can proceed by analogy here, and we can ascribe granting to the AI system. How do we ascribe granting to others? Well, sometimes we do it behaviorally. We look at the behavior of the agent that we're ascribing granting to. So if the dog comes for dinner, when we whistle for the dog, then we can say it grants that dinner will be there. Sometimes we ascribe granting mechanistically. So if the AI system's program and or parameters ensures that it makes use of one data stream but not another, we can say it grants the contents of that data stream but not the other. I don't think this is particularly problematic when the propositional attitude is granting as opposed to, say, knowledge, because the equals G account has this option available to say that certain propositions are implicitly granted. So the dog and the AI system implicitly treat certain propositions as true. I think it's reasonable to ascribe that to the AI system. even if they're not explicitly adopting a mental state towards those propositions. However, it's much more contentious to say that they know these propositions. So the equals K approach has more of a job here to ascribe evidence to these systems. And similarly, there's an alternative approach, the equals B approach, which holds that your evidence is what you believe or what you truly believe. So Veli-Mitova says that your evidence is what you truly believe. And again, it can be a bit of a push to say that the AI system believes the contents of one data stream, but not the other. So I think the equals G approach probably has a response to the challenge that's put forward by AlphaFold 2 and other AI systems, and that this response to the challenge is perhaps more plausible than analogous responses by equals K and equals B. Okay, so I'll stop there just to note a couple of, if you're interested in equals G, a couple of recent papers on equals G, particularly the evidence and cognition paper goes into more detail about the equals G approach. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. As we're running a little bit behind time, I think we'll just take a break just for about 2 minutes, just if people want a toilet break, whatever. So we'll come back in 2 minutes time, say 10 past roughly, and then we'll move to questions. Thanks.